One droid saw everything. He never said a word. He watched a Jedi fall. He watched a republic die and an empire rise from its ashes overnight. He carried a secret that could have gotten a queen, a senator, and a newborn child executed. And he carried it in silence for decades. He was there for a marriage no one was supposed to know about. He was there when younglings were cut down inside a temple that was supposed to be the safest place in the galaxy. He was there, bolted into the cockpit of a burning starfighter, in the last seconds before a planet-killing weapon fired for the very first time. He was there when a mask finally came off a dying man's face, and he was there long before that man ever put the mask on. Almost no one ever thought to ask him what he saw. This is the entire story of R2-D2, not the comic relief rolling along behind the heroes. The witness, the one constant thread running through every single turning point this galaxy ever survived. From a desperate escape above a peaceful world to a father's final breath decades later. Stay with this one to the end, because every time the galaxy stood at the edge of collapse, one small, stubborn droid was already there, quietly holding it together. Long before anyone called him a hero, he was simply a droid. Let's start there, on a green and gold world far from the wars that would one day come to define him. Nothing about his arrival that day suggested the scale of what was coming. No one flagged his unit for anything beyond routine service. He was, in every way that mattered to the factory that built him, ordinary. The world was Naboo, a peaceful planet known for its rolling plains, its underwater cities built by a native species called the Gungans, and its human settlers who prized art, diplomacy, and elegant design in equal measure. Naboo starships were sleek and beautiful, built with curved hulls and polished chrome finishes that looked more like ornaments than vessels of war, and every one of those starships needed a small mechanical companion to keep it running. Astromech droids, like R2, were built for exactly that purpose. They were meant to plug into a ship's systems, to monitor hyperdrive stability, to patch hull breaches, to calculate navigational routes faster than any organic pilot ever could. They were not built to be noticed. They were built to be useful, and then quietly forgotten the moment their task was complete. R2-D2 came into existence as one unit among many, manufactured with a standard astromech chassis, a domed head capable of rotating to survey his surroundings, a small tool arsenal hidden behind compartment panels most people never noticed, and a personality that, if anyone had bothered to look closely, was already beginning to show signs of something unusual. Most astromechs performed their duties with mechanical indifference, executing commands and little else. R2 was different from the moment his processors first came online. He was curious in a way that unsettled some of the technicians who worked on him. He rolled toward sounds he was not instructed to investigate. He lingered near conversations that had nothing to do with his assigned tasks. Some droids are built and simply run their programming until they are decommissioned. R2-D2 seemed, even then, to be paying attention. The technicians who serviced him in those early days sometimes joked, in the way people who work closely with machines often develop small, half-serious superstitions about their equipment, that this particular unit had rolled off the line with a personality already installed. something none of the standard manufacturing specifications could ever quite account for. None of these early quirks were significant enough to flag him for reprogramming. They were simply strange. The sort of thing a technician might mention once in passing and then forget entirely, never suspecting that what they were noticing were the earliest signs of something the galaxy had never quite seen in a droid before. He found his way into service aboard one of the Royal House's starships, tasked with the unglamorous work of maintaining a vessel that carried Naboo's elected monarch on official business across the galaxy. It was quiet work. It was the kind of work that could have defined the rest of his operational life, cycling through routine diagnostics and minor repairs until the day his memory was wiped and his parts were repurposed for some newer model. But quiet worlds rarely stay quiet forever, and Naboo's peace was about to be shattered by a dispute that started with taxation and ended with an invasion. A powerful trade organization, angered by new taxes imposed on the shipping lanes they used to move goods across the galaxy, decided to blockade Naboo entirely, surrounding the planet with warships and cutting off its people from the rest of civilization. It was meant to be a display of economic leverage, a way of pressuring the Republic's government into reversing its policy. Instead, under secret orders from a hidden mastermind manipulating events from the shadows, the blockade escalated into a full invasion. Battle droids poured onto the surface of Naboo. The Royal House's young queen, barely more than a teenager herself, found her palace occupied and her people placed under martial law. And in the chaos of that invasion, two wandering Jedi Knights arrived on Naboo entirely by accident, sent to negotiate a settlement that never had any chance of succeeding because the invasion had never been about negotiation to begin with. It was during the desperate escape from that occupied planet that R2-D2's story truly begins. Though, at the time, nobody watching would have guessed that this particular astromech was about to distinguish himself from every other droid rolling around the hangar bay. The Queen's royal starship carrying her guards, the two Jedi who had rescued her, and a young slave boy the Jedi had picked up along the way after fleeing Naboo through the planet's core, found itself under heavy fire as it tried to break through the remains of the blockade above the planet. Enemy fighters swarmed the ship. Blaster bolts tore through the hull. The deflector shields, essential for surviving in the vacuum of space, began to fail one system at a time. And somewhere in that chaos, a call went out for astromech droids to venture outside the ship and make emergency repairs while the battle raged around them. Most droids sent out on a mission like that did not come back. The vacuum of space is unforgiving, and enemy fire does not discriminate between droid and durasteel. One by one, the astromechs sent out to repair the shield generator were destroyed, picked off by blaster fire as they worked, their small mechanical bodies simply vanishing into the dark. And then it was R2's turn. He rolled out onto the exposed hull of the ship, magnetized feet gripping the metal as the entire vessel shuddered under the impact of incoming fire, and he began to work. Around him, the other droids sent on the same task were destroyed one after another. But R2 kept going, undeterred, focused entirely on the task in front of him, with a kind of single-minded determination that seemed almost impossible for a machine built for nothing more than routine maintenance. He rerouted power. He patched failing systems. He worked through explosions close enough to rock the hull beneath him. And when the ship finally broke free of the blockade and made the jump to light speed, it was in no small part because one small astromech droid had refused to stop working even as everything around him fell apart. The vacuum outside the ship was silent, in the way only space can be silent. A silence that swallowed the flashes of enemy cannon fire and the bright, brief blooms of destroyed droids without ever making a sound a being inside the ship could hear. And yet somehow that silence felt louder than any explosion, pressing in on the small droid as he worked. Magnetized boots, the only thing keeping him tethered to a hull that could have shaken him loose into the endless dark with a single unlucky impact. He did not pause to consider the danger. He did not, in any way a technician reviewing his behavioral logs afterward could identify, hesitate even once, though hesitation would have been the reasonable, expected response for any droid built with even a rudimentary self-preservation subroutine. He simply worked, panel by panel, circuit by circuit, until the shield generator hummed back to life beneath his hands, and the ship's deflectors flickered on just in time to deflect a blast that would otherwise have torn straight through the hull to the passengers sheltering inside. Inside the ship, the young queen noticed. She made a point of thanking the droid personally, an act of courtesy that most droids never received from royalty. And in that moment, R2-D2 earned something that would follow him for the rest of his long life. He earned notice. He earned the attention of people who mattered. And more importantly, he earned it through loyalty and quiet competence, rather than any grand display. It was a pattern that would repeat itself again and again throughout his existence. R2 never sought recognition. He simply did the work, and the work spoke for him. The young slave boy the Jedi had rescued during their escape was, of course, no ordinary child. He had shown an extraordinary connection to the mystical energy field that Jedi drew their power from, an energy called the Force, and the Jedi who had found him believed he might be the answer to an old prophecy about balance being restored to that Force. His name was Anakin, and though R2-D2 crossed paths with him during this first adventure, the deep bond between droid and boy that would come to define so much of galactic history had not yet formed. That would come later, after years had passed, after the boy had grown into a young man, training under the tutelage of the Jedi Order, after the galaxy itself had grown darker and more dangerous than anyone in that fleeing royal starship could have imagined. For now, R2-D2 returned to his duties, servicing the royal fleet, maintaining ships, performing the unglamorous work that made up the vast majority of any astromech's existence. Years passed in relative quiet. The invasion of Naboo became a memory, a story told to explain how a young queen had helped liberate her own world, how a hidden Sith Lord had been unmasked and destroyed in the palace throne room, how the boy from the desert planet had been accepted into the Jedi Order despite grave misgivings from some of its senior members. R2-D2 was not central to any of these stories as they were told and retold across the galaxy. He was, at most, a footnote, a helpful droid who had done his part during a crisis and then faded back into the background of ordinary life. But droids like R2 do not truly fade. They wait. They continue their routines, quietly accumulating experience, quietly becoming more capable through repetition and use, even if their base programming never changes. And when the galaxy needed him again, he was ready, positioned by circumstance and by the strange threads of fate that seemed to follow him, to step back into the center of events far larger than any single astromech droid should ever have found himself tangled up in. The years of uneasy peace across the galaxy could not last. Tensions that had been building for a decade beneath the surface of Republic politics finally erupted into open conflict when an entire sector of star systems declared their intention to separate from the galactic government, forming a new movement determined to break away from what they saw as a corrupt and bloated Senate. Diplomacy failed. Assassination attempts were made against key political figures, and soon, armies began to mobilize on both sides. One built from an army of clones grown in secret on a remote world, the other built from an ever-expanding force of battle droids manufactured in the millions by industrial conglomerates who had thrown their support behind the separatist cause. The galaxy was sliding toward a war that would eventually be remembered as the Clone Wars, and R2-D2, who had spent the intervening years performing unremarkable maintenance work, found himself reassigned in a way that would change the rest of his existence. The boy he had briefly crossed paths with during the Naboo crisis was now a young man, tall, gifted, and increasingly regarded as one of the most naturally talented Jedi the Order had trained in generations. He had also grown reckless, impatient, and prone to attachments that his teachers warned him against forming, since the Jedi Order taught that attachment led inevitably to fear, and fear led to the kind of dark impulses a Jedi was meant to rise above. It was this young Jedi Knight who found himself paired, almost by accident, with the very same astromech droid who had once helped his queen escape a doomed planet years earlier. R2-D2 became his personal astromech, assigned to his starfighter, present at his side through mission after mission as the war expanded across dozens of star systems. Their partnership was, from the outset, unlike anything R2 had experienced before. Most Jedi treated their astromechs as equipment, useful but ultimately replaceable. This young Jedi treated R2 differently. He spoke to him not just as a machine to be commanded, but almost as a companion, someone whose input mattered, whose loyalty was returned rather than simply expected. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of a galaxy tearing itself apart in war, but it mattered enormously to a droid who had spent his entire existence being useful without ever being truly seen. For the first time, R2-D2 was not just a tool. He was a partner. The Clone Wars took them to worlds most beings would never see in a single lifetime. They fought in the skies above besieged cities, where enemy fighters filled the air in numbers too great to count. They dove through asteroid fields while being pursued by droid starfighters, R2's small mechanical arms working feverishly to keep systems online while his pilot pulled maneuvers that would have destroyed a lesser ship. Time and again, when the young Jedi starfighter took damage severe enough to threaten a total systems failure, it was R2 who kept them alive, patching hyperdrive motivators mid-flight, rerouting power from failing systems to critical ones. Working with a calm efficiency that belied the chaos exploding around him, he developed a reputation among the Jedi and clone officers who fought alongside this partnership. A reputation as the droid who simply did not fail, no matter how dire the circumstances became. There were missions during those war years that would have ended in disaster without R2's quiet intervention. There was a rescue of an older, more senior Jedi Master, captured by enemy forces and held in circumstances that seemed designed to be inescapable where it was R2 who managed to slip through security systems undetected, disabling defenses that would have stopped an organic infiltrator in moments. There was a campaign fought on a world covered almost entirely in water, where R2 had to adapt to operating conditions his base programming had never anticipated, proving himself capable of far more than routine astromech duties ever required. There was a mission to a planet of cloud cities and industrial factories, where his ability to interface with foreign computer systems and extract information no organic being could have accessed in time proved the difference between victory and catastrophic failure. Each mission added to a growing, if largely unspoken, understanding among those who worked closely with this particular droid. R2-D2 was not ordinary. He never had been. Alongside the young Jedi's adventures in battle came a development that R2-D2, perhaps more than any other being in the galaxy, was uniquely positioned to witness. The young Jedi had fallen in love, a forbidden thing for a member of the Jedi Order, whose code demanded detachment from exactly the kind of romantic bond he had formed with a former queen turned senator, a woman as devoted to the Republic's ideals as he was devoted to her. Jedi were not permitted to marry. It would have meant expulsion from the Order, or worse, depending on how the Council chose to interpret the violation. And yet, in secret, away from the eyes of his fellow Jedi, away from the Senate that would have found the union scandalous for entirely different political reasons, the young Jedi married the woman he loved in a small, private ceremony, attended by almost no one. R2-D2 was there, along with a protocol droid who served the senator and who fussed anxiously over the arrangements. R2 stood witness to a secret that could have unraveled careers, reputations, and perhaps the entire war effort if it had come to light at the wrong moment. And he never told. Not the Jedi Council, who would have demanded answers. Not the Senate, who thrived on scandal. Not any of the dozens of officers and officials who passed within arm's reach of him every single day, any one of whom might have paid handsomely for information about a Jedi Knight's secret marriage to a sitting senator. R2-D2 kept the secret because his loyalty was not to institutions or to protocol. It was to the people who had earned his trust. And he understood, in whatever way a droid can understand such things, that some information was not his to give away. This pattern of quiet discretion would define R2 for the rest of his long existence. But during those war years, it was tested more than once, and never more severely than in the secrets that began accumulating around the young Jedi's growing fear. He had begun to suffer visions, terrible dreams of losing the woman he loved, dreams that echoed a premonition he had once had about his own mother, a premonition that had come devastatingly true. The fear ate at him. It made him reckless in battle. It made him susceptible to whispers from people who understood exactly how to exploit a frightened young man's desperation to save the person he loved most. R2-D2, ever present at his side, likely witnessed more of this unraveling than anyone else in the galaxy, watching a brilliant, talented Jedi slowly consumed by a fear the Order had warned him about since childhood, a fear he had never been taught how to properly release. There was one campaign in particular, fought above a world wreathed in permanent storms, that those who served alongside R2 during the war years would later describe as the moment they truly understood what this droid was capable of. The young Jedi's starfighter had taken catastrophic damage during a dogfight against overwhelming numbers, its main systems failing one after another as it spiraled toward the storm-racked surface below. Any other astromech would have simply recorded the failure and prepared for destruction along with the ship it served. R2-D2 instead worked with a frantic, focused intensity that seemed to defy the panic any reasonable observer might have expected from a machine facing its own imminent destruction. He rerouted the last available power to the repulsor lift systems. He sealed a hull breach with material never designed for that purpose, improvising a solution his base programming had never anticipated. And when the starfighter finally leveled out mere moments before impact, it was clear to everyone watching that this small droid had done something closer to genuine problem-solving than mere mechanical repair. He had, in the truest sense, saved 2 lives that day, his own and his pilot's, through nothing but stubborn ingenuity. There was another mission, quieter but no less dangerous, in which R2 was tasked with infiltrating an enemy command ship to extract vital intelligence about troop movements that would determine the outcome of an entire campaign. Disguised as a maintenance unit, rolling through corridors, patrolled by droids who had no reason to suspect him, R2 accessed terminal after terminal, extracting encrypted files while evading detection through a combination of careful timing and what could only be described as intuition, an ability to sense, in some fashion no engineer could ever fully explain, exactly when to pause and when to move. He returned to the fleet with information that shifted the entire balance of the campaign. And, characteristically, he never sought credit for what he had accomplished. He simply returned to his post beside his pilot's starfighter and resumed his ordinary duties as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. It was not only skill that marked R2 as unusual among his kind, but a certain willful streak that occasionally put him at odds with the very beings he served. He disobeyed direct orders on more than one occasion during the war, choosing instead to act on his own judgment when he believed, correctly as it turned out, that following instructions exactly as given would lead to disaster. Most droids were not built with enough autonomy to make that kind of choice, and those that were built with such autonomy rarely exercised it in ways that ran contrary to their master's wishes. R2-D2 did so repeatedly, and repeatedly his stubbornness proved justified. It made him, in the eyes of those who worked closely with him, less like a piece of equipment and more like a soldier with a mind of his own, one who happened to communicate in beeps and whistles rather than words. The war ground on for years, consuming worlds, consuming lives, consuming the idealism that had once defined the Republic's cause. Somewhere in the highest levels of galactic government, a plan had been unfolding since long before the war even began. A plan orchestrated by a figure hidden in plain sight, manipulating both sides of the conflict toward an outcome that would leave the Republic's own government transformed into something far darker than anyone had anticipated. R2-D2 had no way of knowing the full scope of that scheme. He was, after all, an astromech droid, built for starship maintenance rather than political intrigue. But he was present for pieces of it nonetheless. Present in hangars and command centers and cockpits where conversations happened that, taken together, told a story of manipulation on a galactic scale. The end, when it came, arrived with a suddenness that left no room for anyone to process what was happening before it was already too late. A coded order was transmitted to every clone trooper serving across the galaxy. An order that had been embedded in their training from the moment they were grown. An order that overrode every instinct of loyalty and camaraderie they had built with the Jedi commanders who had led them into battle for years. The order was simple, and it was devastating. Every Jedi, wherever they stood, was to be executed immediately by the very clone troopers who had fought alongside them. The purge that followed became one of the darkest single events in galactic history. A night and day of coordinated betrayal that saw Jedi Masters and Padawans cut down without warning by soldiers they had trusted with their lives. It happened everywhere at once. On distant battlefields and in quiet temple halls alike, clone troopers who had shared campfires and battle plans and years of hard-won trust with their Jedi commanders, turning on them in a single, coordinated instant, their loyalty rewritten by a hidden command buried so deep in their conditioning that not even they had known it was there until the moment it activated. Some Jedi managed to survive, scattering into hiding across the galaxy, disguising themselves, burying their connection to the Force as deeply as they could manage, in hopes of evading the hunters who would soon be sent after them. Most did not. And at the center of the transformation that made this purge possible stood the very same young Jedi Knight R2-D2 had served faithfully throughout the war. A man whose fear had finally been exploited to its fullest, darkest conclusion. He had turned. He had accepted a new identity, a new master, and a new purpose that had nothing to do with the ideals he had once sworn to protect. What R2-D2 witnessed during those final days of the war, and in the chaotic hours that followed, remains one of the most quietly debated mysteries in his long history. He was present for pieces of the transformation. He may have been present for far more than pieces. Some accounts suggest he saw enough to piece together exactly what had happened to the young man he had served for years. Exactly what that man had become, and exactly what he had done in the name of the new order rising to replace the Republic. If he did see these things, he never spoke of them. Not because he could not, but because whatever consequences might follow from that knowledge, R2-D2 seemed to understand instinctively that silence was safer, both for himself and for anyone who might come to depend on him in the uncertain future. The Republic that had employed him, protected him, and given his existence purpose collapsed within days, reorganized into a new galactic empire under the leadership of a chancellor who revealed himself in the same devastating stroke to be the very Sith Lord who had orchestrated the entire war from its beginning. The Jedi Order, which had numbered in the thousands, was reduced to a scattered handful of survivors in hiding. And the woman R2 had once helped keep a secret marriage safe from prying eyes, now found herself widowed in every meaningful sense. Her husband transformed into something monstrous, something that no longer answered to the name she had once loved. It was in the immediate aftermath of this collapse that R2-D2 passed into new hands, hands that belonged to a senator from a peaceful, mountainous world who had quietly opposed the rise of the new empire, even as he publicly maintained the appearance of loyalty required to survive in the increasingly dangerous political landscape. This senator understood the value of a droid who had served through the war years, a droid who had seen things, who had access to information that could prove useful or dangerous, depending on who eventually came to possess it. He had known the young Jedi in his better days, had worked alongside him during the war on matters of Senate liaison and military coordination, and he recognized the droid who had served at that Jedi's side long before he ever learned the full, devastating truth of what that same Jedi had become. Taking R2 into his household was, in part, a practical decision. The acquisition of a skilled and proven astromech at a time when skilled droids were in short supply. but it was also, quietly, an act of something closer to mercy, a recognition that this small droid deserved better than to be discarded or reprogrammed into obscurity, simply because the war that had shaped his finest years had ended in catastrophe. And here, historians and those who have studied R2's long service record have long debated a single crucial question that has never been fully resolved. Did this droid's memory get wiped, as was standard procedure for droids changing ownership during that unstable, paranoid period when the new Empire was rooting out anyone connected to the fallen Jedi Order? Or did he, through some quiet arrangement, some understanding between droid and senator, retain every memory intact, choosing for decades afterward to simply never reveal what he knew? Official records suggest a standard memory wipe was performed. The same procedure applied to countless droids during that period as a security precaution against exactly the kind of dangerous knowledge R2 might have carried. And yet those who observed his behavior in the years that followed noted something strange. He seemed, at times, to react to certain names, certain places, certain half-finished references to the war years, with a hesitation that a truly wiped memory should not have produced. He seemed to understand context that a droid starting fresh should never have possessed. Whether this was simply the pattern recognition of a sophisticated machine reconstructing familiar situations, or whether it was the ghost of memories that had never truly been erased, hidden in some corner of his processes that the standard wipe procedure had failed to reach, remains one of the great unanswered mysteries of his existence. R2-D2 himself, of course, never clarified the matter. He simply continued his service, quiet, competent, and utterly unreadable to anyone trying to determine exactly how much he remembered of the galaxy that had been lost. Perhaps that unreadability was the point. Perhaps a droid who had learned, across years of war and secrecy, exactly how dangerous certain knowledge could be, had also learned the one lesson that mattered more than any technical skill programmed into him at his creation: that some truths survive longest, not when they are shouted, but when they are simply, patiently carried in silence. Those who favor the theory that his memory remained intact point to small, telling moments that surfaced in the years following the purge. There was an occasion, recorded almost in passing by a member of the senator's household staff, when R2 rolled past a hollow projector displaying an old news broadcast about the fallen Republic, and paused, motionless, for a length of time that had no logical explanation rooted in any diagnostic or maintenance task. There was another occasion when a name belonging to a Jedi Master, long presumed dead, was mentioned in casual conversation nearby, and R2 emitted a low, mournful series of tones that the protocol droid at his side, despite years of experience translating his companion's binary language, could not fully render into any standard phrase, only describing it afterward as sounding like grief. These moments proved nothing conclusively. Droids, after all, can develop unusual behavioral quirks through long use, regardless of what their memory banks do or do not contain. But taken together, across years of small, unexplainable pauses and reactions, they painted a picture that many who knew him found difficult to dismiss entirely. Others who favor the theory that his memory was genuinely wiped point out, with equal justification, that a droid, capable of retaining such dangerous knowledge through the most paranoid and thorough security purge in galactic history, would have represented an almost impossible security risk. one that a cautious senator working to protect a hidden child would have been unlikely to accept no matter how much he had come to value the droid's service. Standard procedure existed precisely because the Empire's new secret police, hunting down any thread that might lead to surviving Jedi or their sympathizers, would not have hesitated to interrogate droids as readily as they interrogated organic beings. And a droid carrying visible memories of a Jedi Knight's fall to darkness would have been a liability too dangerous to keep. Under this theory, whatever R2 seemed to remember was nothing more than sophisticated pattern recognition, an accumulation of context clues assembled from years of proximity to the people and events in question, mistaken by sentimental observers for something deeper than it truly was. The debate has never been resolved, and it is entirely possible it never will be, since the one being who could settle the matter definitively has spent his entire existence choosing silence over explanation on nearly every subject that matters. What can be said with certainty is only this: whatever R2-D2 knew or did not know about the tragedy that had unfolded during those final days of the Republic, he carried himself afterward in a manner indistinguishable from a droid who understood exactly how dangerous that knowledge would be if it ever came to light. He served without complaint. He kept whatever secrets he held, real or reconstructed, locked away behind a demeanor of routine competence that revealed nothing to anyone who did not already know what to look for. And even those who knew him best, who had worked beside him for years and learned to read meaning into the particular pitch and rhythm of his mechanical voice, could never quite say with confidence where the line between genuine memory and simple pattern recognition actually fell. And in a galaxy where entire families were being torn apart over far less than what this small droid may have carried inside him, that discretion likely saved more lives than anyone would ever know to thank him for. Whatever the truth of his memory, R2-D2 settled into a new chapter of existence under the ownership of the senator who had taken him in, a chapter defined not by the chaos of open warfare, but by something arguably more dangerous: the slow, patient work of quiet resistance conducted in the shadow of an empire that punished dissent with ruthless efficiency. The senator's household included a protocol droid, prim, anxious, and endlessly talkative, who found himself paired once again with the same astromech he had known during the war years, though whether either droid retained clear memory of their earlier acquaintance was, like so much else from that period, left frustratingly uncertain. The two droids settled into an odd, bickering companionship that would, in time, become one of the most enduring partnerships in the galaxy's long and complicated history, one droid fussy and rule-bound, the other stubborn and quietly rebellious, in ways that often left his companion exasperated beyond measure. The protocol droid complained constantly about the indignity of his circumstances, about the danger, about the general recklessness of his smaller companion's decision-making, and yet he never once, in all the years that followed, actually abandoned him, following the astromech into situations that any properly programmed protocol droid should have had every reason to avoid. There was a strange kind of devotion buried underneath all that complaining, a loyalty that revealed itself not in words, since words were the one thing the protocol droid never seemed to run short of, but in action, in the simple fact that whenever it mattered most, he was always there beside his smaller companion, grumbling the entire way. Their dynamic became, over the years, something close to a running joke among those who knew them both: the anxious, talkative protocol droid, forever trailing after his blunt, uncooperative counterpart, forever predicting disaster, forever being proven both right and wrong, in roughly equal measure. But beneath the bickering lay something the household came to rely on more than they perhaps realized. A partnership between two very different machines that, together, proved more capable than either would have been alone. One providing translation, protocol, and diplomatic fluency. The other providing technical skill, quiet, cunning, and a willingness to bend rules that his companion would never have dared to break on his own. The senator's household extended its protection not just to droids, but to a newborn child, an infant girl whose birth had been shrouded in secrecy and danger, delivered into hiding in the same terrible hours that had seen her mother's final breath and her father's final transformation into the very instrument of the Empire's tyranny. The senator and his wife adopted this child as their own, raising her within a loving household. Even as the senator continued his dangerous double life, publicly cooperating with an empire he privately worked to undermine at every opportunity. R2-D2, present in that household through the girl's earliest years, became something of a quiet fixture in her upbringing. One more presence among the staff and droids who helped raise a child destined, though none could have known it then, to become one of the most important figures in the galaxy's future. The years that followed unfolded slowly, almost peacefully, at least on the surface. R2-D2 performed his duties, maintained the senator's ships, and watched, in his own quiet way, as the adopted daughter of his household grew from an infant into a child, and eventually into a young woman with her mother's grace and her father's fire. Though she would not learn the truth of either parent for many years still to come, the galaxy around them grew darker with each passing year. The Empire tightened its grip on system after system, crushing dissent, expanding its military presence, and beginning construction, in absolute secrecy, on a weapon so devastating that its very existence, once revealed, would reshape the balance of power across the entire galaxy. R2-D2 had no way of knowing, during those quiet years of routine service, that he was about to be pulled once again into the center of events that would determine the fate of everyone he had ever served. Before that day arrived, though, there were still years of quieter work to fill, and it is worth pausing on them, because it was in these unremarkable stretches of service that R2-D2's character, if a droid can be said to have character, revealed itself most clearly. He was not a droid who waited passively for the next crisis. He filled his days with the small, unglamorous tasks that kept a senator's household running, tending to the diplomatic shuttle that carried its owner between his home world and the capital, running diagnostics on communication arrays that needed to remain secure from Imperial monitoring, and, occasionally, when no one else was watching closely enough to notice, quietly repairing pieces of equipment that had nothing to do with his assigned duties, simply because he had determined, in whatever passes for judgment inside an astromech's processors, that the equipment needed fixing. It was during these years that the household's secret resistance activities began to expand beyond quiet political maneuvering into something more organized, more dangerous, and far more consequential. The senator was not alone in his opposition to the Empire. Others across the galaxy, some of them former colleagues from his Senate days, some of them entirely new allies, drawn together by shared outrage at the Empire's growing brutality, began coordinating in secret, sharing information, smuggling supplies to worlds suffering under Imperial occupation, and slowly building the framework of what would eventually become organized rebellion. R2-D2 found himself present for meetings that were never recorded in any official log, present for the transfer of encrypted data that could have gotten everyone involved executed if discovered, present for whispered conversations conducted in darkened rooms long after the household's other staff had gone to sleep. He never once betrayed what he witnessed. This was not, it must be understood, a simple matter of programming preventing him from speaking. Protocol droids like his companion were, by design, talkative to the point of exhaustion, sharing information freely whenever asked, following etiquette and procedure without much capacity for discretion beyond what their programming explicitly demanded. R2-D2 was different. His discretion seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. Some accumulated sense of loyalty built up over years of service to people who had trusted him with their most dangerous secrets, and who had never once been betrayed for that trust. There was one incident in particular that came closer than any other to unraveling everything the senator and his allies had worked so carefully to protect. An Imperial inspection team arrived unannounced at the household's estate, ostensibly to conduct a routine audit of the senator's personal starships, in compliance with new regulations governing private vessels, capable of long-range travel, but in truth conducting exactly the kind of search the household had feared for months. A search for evidence of exactly the sort of rebellious activity the senator had been quietly funding. The inspection team demanded access to every droid on the property, intending to review their memory logs for anything incriminating. Most of the household's astromechs and service droids submitted to the inspection without incident, their memories containing nothing more suspicious than routine maintenance records. R2-D2, when his turn came, proved considerably less cooperative. He stalled. He produced error messages that baffled the inspecting officer's own technician, feigning corrupted memory sectors that required lengthy diagnostic procedures to even access, procedures that consumed the better part of an afternoon without ever actually yielding the information the inspectors were searching for. Whether this obstruction was a calculated act of resistance, born from whatever awareness he retained of what those logs might reveal, or simply an unfortunate coincidence of genuine technical malfunction at the worst possible moment, no one in the household could say for certain, though most who knew him well enough suspected the former. The inspection team eventually gave up, filing a report that noted the droid's outdated systems as the likely cause of the delay, and moved on to the next estate on their list, never suspecting how close they had come to uncovering a resistance network that stretched across dozens of worlds. The senator, informed of the incident afterward, reportedly said nothing to R2 directly, but from that day forward, treated the droid with a level of trust he extended to almost no one else in his household, droid or otherwise. The daughter of the household grew older during these years, developing a fierce intelligence and an equally fierce sense of justice that mirrored both of the parents she would not learn the truth about until much later in her life. She grew close to the droids who had been fixtures in her household for as long as she could remember, though she likely never suspected the full extent of what the small, temperamental astromech had witnessed before she was even born. To her, he was simply a familiar presence, a slightly cantankerous fixture of home who had always been there, rolling through the hangar and the halls of the estate long before she was old enough to understand that his presence there was anything but ordinary. There were moments, according to those who observed the household during this period, when R2 seemed to watch her with something that, in an organic being, might have been called tenderness, a quiet attentiveness that went beyond his standard operating parameters, as though some part of him remembered exactly whose child she truly was, and felt a corresponding obligation to watch over her. As a small child, she had been fascinated by him in the particular way that children are drawn to things adults consider merely functional. She would sit beside him in the estate's hangar bay, while the household's technicians performed routine maintenance, asking him questions in a language he could not answer with words, content simply to listen to his replies as though his beeps and whistles carried meaning she alone could sense. She gave him small, informal tasks that had nothing to do with his official duties, asking him to help her sort through old data files out of simple curiosity, or to project star charts onto the hangar wall, so she could trace the shapes of distant systems with her finger before she had ever set foot on a starship herself. He indulged her. It was, perhaps, the closest thing to genuine affection that a droid built for astromech maintenance ever displayed toward anyone, and though she would not understand the full weight of that affection until years later, some part of her seemed to sense, even as a child, that this particular droid was different from the others in the household, that he carried himself with a kind of quiet gravity none of the other service droids possessed. As she grew older and began accompanying her adoptive father on official diplomatic business, R2 was often assigned to service the shuttles and starfighters she used for travel, and it became something of an unspoken tradition between them that she would seek him out before any particularly dangerous mission, checking in on his diagnostics herself, rather than leaving the task entirely to the estate's technical staff. It was a small ritual, easily overlooked by anyone not paying close attention, but it spoke to a bond that had formed slowly over years of proximity, a bond neither of them ever named directly, but that both of them, in their own way, clearly understood. Meanwhile, far from the senator's quiet estate, the Empire's secret weapon neared completion, deep in a remote system, hidden from all but a small circle of the Emperor's most trusted engineers and officers. An enormous space station capable of destroying entire planets in a single devastating blast was entering its final stages of construction. The senator, through his network of contacts and informants, began receiving fragments of information about this project, terrifying rumors that, if true, represented a threat unlike anything the galaxy had faced before. A weapon so powerful that no rebellion, however well organized, could hope to stand against it through conventional military means. Stealing the technical plans for this weapon, understanding its vulnerabilities before it could be used against defenseless worlds, became an obsession for those working within the growing rebellion, and it was an obsession that would, before long, place R2-D2 directly at the center of the single most consequential mission of his entire existence. The daughter of the household, now grown into a capable young woman, serving as both a senator in her own right and a secret operative for the rebellion her adoptive father had helped build, took on increasingly dangerous assignments as the rebellion's activities expanded. She possessed her mother's diplomatic skill and her father's stubborn courage, though she wore both qualities with a fierceness entirely her own, forged by a childhood spent watching her adoptive parents risk everything for a cause greater than themselves. The rumors that reached the household grew steadily more specific and more alarming as months passed. Agents working within the rebellion's growing network reported sightings of an object in deep space so enormous that early observers initially mistook it for a small, misshapen moon, a mistake that would later prove darkly appropriate given the weapon's true purpose. engineers who had once worked on imperial contracts, some of them defectors who had grown horrified by what they were being asked to help build, provided fragmentary technical details that suggested a single catastrophic weakness buried deep within the station's otherwise impregnable design. A vulnerability that, if properly understood, could theoretically be exploited by a small, precise strike rather than a conventional fleet engagement that the rebellion had no hope of winning outright. But fragments were not enough. Someone needed the complete technical schematics, the full architectural plans that would reveal exactly where that vulnerability lay and exactly how narrow the window would be to exploit it. The daughter of the household, now operating under increasing personal risk, as both a public senator and a secret rebellion operative, found herself perfectly positioned through channels she had spent years carefully cultivating to acquire those plans. It was dangerous work, the kind of work that could end in imprisonment or execution if she were caught, and she pursued it anyway with the same stubborn conviction that had defined her since childhood. It was this young woman who would soon place into R2-D2's memory banks the single most valuable piece of information in the galaxy, entrusting a small, unassuming astromech droid with a responsibility that would determine whether the Empire's terrible new weapon could ever be stopped. But that mission, and everything that followed from it, belongs to the next chapter of this story. A chapter that would carry R2-D2 across a desert world, into the company of an old hermit who had once been a great Jedi Knight, and eventually into the middle of a battle fought in the vacuum of space against a weapon capable of erasing entire worlds from existence. For now, it is enough to understand where he stood at the close of this chapter of his long service. He was a droid who had crossed an ocean of secrets and survived every one of them intact. He had watched an idealistic young Jedi fall into darkness and had said nothing. He had watched a secret marriage form and dissolve into tragedy and had said nothing. He had watched a newborn child hidden away for her own protection and had quietly helped raise her without ever revealing who her parents truly were. Whatever memories lived inside his processors, wiped clean or carefully preserved, he carried the weight of the galaxy's most dangerous secrets with a steadiness that no organic being, however disciplined, could ever have fully matched. And soon, that steadiness would be tested one final time, in a mission that would take him further from home than he had ever traveled, toward a destiny that had been quietly waiting for him since the day a young queen first thanked a small astromech droid for saving her ship. If you trace the shape of his existence up to this point, a pattern begins to emerge, one that would come to define the rest of his long service in ways no engineer could have designed into him from the start. He was never the one giving orders. He was never the one whose name appeared in official reports, never the one honored in ceremonies or remembered in the history texts that would eventually be written about this era. And yet at every single turning point, he was there, steady, watchful, quietly, indispensable, the small, constant thread running beneath the surface of events that history would later credit entirely to the organic beings standing in front of him. Perhaps that is simply the nature of droids in a galaxy built by and for organic life. Perhaps it is something more particular to him, some quality baked into his earliest programming or acquired slowly through decades of accumulated experience. A stubbornness, a loyalty, a willingness to keep going long after any reasonable being or machine would have given up. Whatever the explanation, the years ahead would only deepen that pattern, carrying him from a senator's quiet estate into the middle of a rebellion. And from there, into a legend that would outlast every empire that ever rose or fell across the stars. That legend, the part of his story most beings across the galaxy would eventually come to know, was still waiting just beyond the horizon, gathering shape in the quiet hours of a household that had no idea how soon everything was about to change. The mission itself began in the kind of tense, hurried secrecy that had become second nature to the young senator and her allies. She had finally obtained what the rebellion had spent months searching for: a complete set of technical schematics detailing the design of the Empire's terrible new battle station, stolen at enormous personal risk by agents who would pay for that theft with their lives before the information ever reached her hands. She knew, the moment those plans were secured aboard her ship, that she was now the single most wanted individual in the galaxy, hunted not by ordinary Imperial forces, but by the personal attention of the very man who had once been her father in every sense but blood, a man who now wore black armor and answered to a name that no longer belonged to the person she had briefly known existed. Her ship was intercepted before it could reach safety, boarded by Imperial forces under the command of that same masked figure, a towering presence whose breath rasped through a respirator, with a sound that had already become synonymous with terror across a dozen star systems. He strode through the corridors of her captured vessel with a cold, methodical purpose, questioning her crew, searching every compartment for the plans he somehow already seemed to know were aboard, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who understood that his prey had nowhere left to run. In the desperate moments before boarding parties swept through the corridors, the senator made a choice that would set the entire remaining story of R2-D2's existence into motion. She recorded a message, brief, urgent, and addressed to an old ally she had never personally met, a retired Jedi Master, living in exile on a remote desert world, pleading for help and explaining, in careful, coded language, the danger the stolen plans represented if they fell back into Imperial hands. She encoded the complete technical schematics into the memory banks of the small astromech droid standing nearby. The very same droid who had once helped a young queen escape this same family's home world decades earlier. And with her ship surrounded and no other options remaining, she gave him a task that would test everything he had ever learned about discretion, loyalty, and survival. He was to find his way to the desert world, locate the retired Jedi Master, and deliver both the message and the plans into hands she trusted more than any other in the galaxy. It was, by any measure, an impossible assignment for a single astromech droid with no weapons, no combat training beyond the improvised ingenuity he had developed over years of war, and no guarantee whatsoever that he would even reach the planet's surface before Imperial forces overran the ship entirely. R2-D2 did not hesitate. Alongside his anxious protocol droid companion, who protested the entire plan with his usual mixture of fear and reluctant loyalty, R2 made his way to an escape pod as the ship shuddered under the impact of boarding clamps and the tramp of stormtrooper boots echoed through corridors that had, until moments earlier, been quiet and familiar. The escape pod launched into the vast dark just as Imperial forces swept through the final corridors of the captured ship, tumbling away from the doomed vessel and toward the pale curve of a desert world, turning slowly below. The senator herself was captured in those final moments, taken prisoner by the masked figure who had once been someone entirely different, though neither of them, in that terrible instant, could have known how directly their fates would soon become entangled again through the actions of the small droid now hurtling toward the planet's surface in a pod barely large enough to hold him and his companion. The pod crashed down onto a world of endless sand and twin suns, a harsh, unforgiving landscape scattered with moisture farms and small settlements clinging to survival at the edges of vast, empty dune seas, where the heat shimmered visibly above the ground even in the earliest hours of morning, and where nightfall brought a cold just as punishing in its own way as the daytime sun had been. It was, though neither droid could have known it at the time, the very same world where a young Jedi's own story had once begun decades earlier. The same sands that had once belonged to a slave boy before fate carried him to Naboo and into the Jedi Order that would eventually consume and transform him. There was a symmetry to this coincidence that no one present would fully appreciate until much later, a sense that certain places in the galaxy seemed destined to keep drawing the same threads of history back through them again and again, whether by chance or by something closer to design. The two droids separated shortly after landing, when the protocol droid insisted on taking one direction, while R2 stubbornly insisted on another, found themselves alone in a landscape that offered little mercy to travelers without proper equipment or preparation. R2 rolled across the dunes with the same single-minded determination that had once carried him across the exposed hull of a starship under fire, following an internal compass that pointed, with a certainty he could not fully explain even to himself, toward a set of coordinates buried in the fragment of the message he had been entrusted to deliver. He was not, strictly speaking, supposed to know exactly where those coordinates led, but something in him seemed to recognize the name attached to them, a name that stirred whatever remained of his oldest memories, wiped or otherwise, and he pressed forward through the heat and the sand with a purpose that left no room for doubt. It was on this world that R2-D2's path crossed with a family whose lives would become permanently entangled with his own and with the fate of the entire galaxy. He was captured, along with his protocol droid companion once they were reunited, by small scavenging creatures who made their living salvaging and reselling old technology from across the wastes, and sold, along with a handful of other droids, to a moisture farmer and his nephew, a restless young man whose days were spent dreaming of adventures far beyond the horizon of the only world he had ever known. That young man's name was Luke, and though he had no way of knowing it yet, he was the son of the very Jedi Knight. R2 had once served faithfully through years of war, a boy who had been hidden away on this remote, unremarkable world for his own protection, raised by relatives who understood exactly what he might become if his true heritage were ever discovered. The moment R2-D2 was brought into that household, the careful plan the young senator had set into motion aboard her captured ship finally began to unfold in earnest. While being cleaned and serviced by the farm's droid maintenance routines, a fragment of the recorded message, hidden in his memory banks, activated, projecting a small, flickering image of the senator pleading for help. An image the young farm boy happened to catch only a portion of before the recording cut off, leaving him consumed with curiosity about the rest. R2, when questioned about the full message, proved evasive in exactly the manner that had defined his entire existence, claiming ignorance, feigning malfunction, deflecting every attempt to access the complete recording, because he understood, with whatever capacity a droid possesses for understanding, that the message was meant for one recipient only, and that recipient was not a restless farm boy, no matter how earnestly he pleaded to see the rest. That single act of stubborn discretion set off a chain of events that would reshape the boy's entire life. Frustrated by the droid's evasiveness and driven by his own restless curiosity, he eventually discovered that R2 had slipped away from the farm entirely during the night, driven by his own internal directive to seek out the person the message had truly been intended for. The boy, along with his uncle's other new astromech, the same fussy protocol droid who had accompanied R2 since the earliest days of the war, set out into the wastes to recover the runaway droid before his absence could be discovered, and the household's already precarious finances suffered further strain from the loss of paid property. What the boy found instead, out among the rocks and canyons at the edge of the settled territory, was an old hermit, living alone in a modest dwelling built into the stone, a man whose presence in that desolate place had puzzled the boy's family for as long as he could remember. The hermit's name, as it turned out, was not entirely unfamiliar to those who had lived through the final years of the Republic, though very few people still living remembered it, and fewer still would have connected it to the quiet, weathered old man who spent his days watching over a farm boy from a respectful distance without ever explaining why. He had once been a Jedi Knight of considerable renown, a general who had fought through the entirety of the Clone Wars, mentor to the very man who would later become the boy's father. Though that final, devastating piece of the boy's heritage remained carefully withheld from him during their first meeting, revealed only in careful, incomplete fragments that left as many questions as answers. The old hermit spoke of a father who had died at the hands of the very figure now serving the Empire. A story that was, depending on how one chose to interpret the old man's careful, evasive phrasing, either an outright fabrication designed to protect the boy from a truth he was not yet ready to face, or a kind of grieving shorthand for a death the hermit genuinely believed had already occurred. The idealistic young Jedi he had once trained, having been, in every meaningful sense that mattered to him, replaced entirely by the figure who now hunted them both. It was this old hermit who took possession of R2-D2's message in full, watching the recorded plea from a senator he had known personally decades earlier. And it was this same old hermit who made the decision, difficult and dangerous as it was, to leave his long exile behind and answer her call for help. The days that followed carried R2-D2 into circumstances far removed from the quiet farm life he had briefly settled into. He and his protocol droid companion, along with the boy and the old hermit, traveled to a lawless port town notorious across the region for smugglers, bounty hunters, and every variety of criminal enterprise the Empire had never quite managed to stamp out. A warren of narrow streets and crowded cantinas where a dozen different species haggled over cargo of dubious origin, and where asking too many questions of the wrong stranger could easily prove fatal. It was there, in a smoke-filled establishment thick with the noise of alien music and louder conversation, that they encountered a smuggler captain and his towering, shaggy first mate, pilots of a battered but remarkably fast freighter, who agreed, for a considerable sum of money the old hermit could barely afford, to carry them off-world and deliver the stolen plans to wherever the scattered remnants of organized rebellion could still be found. R2, loaded into a hidden compartment along with the ship's other cargo, as Imperial patrols swept through the port searching for exactly the group he traveled with, remained perfectly still and perfectly silent through a search that came close enough to discovery that even a droid without functioning nerves might have registered something approaching genuine fear. They escaped the port world only narrowly, pursued into open space by an Imperial cruiser that very nearly ran them down before the freighter's pilot managed a daring jump to light speed. And it was during the tense, cramped journey that followed that R2-D2 found himself, for perhaps the first time in his long existence, in the close company of exactly the kind of people who represented everything the Empire feared most: rebels, dreamers, and outlaws, united by nothing more than a shared refusal to accept the galaxy's new order as permanent. The freighter's destination was a massive Rebel Alliance ship hidden deep in space, far from Imperial patrol routes. And it was there, finally, that R2-D2 delivered the plans he had carried across an ocean of danger, transmitting the complete technical schematics into the rebellion's own systems for analysis by their best engineers and strategists. The analysis that followed confirmed the fragments of intelligence the rebellion had already gathered from other sources. The terrible weapon possessed a single, narrow vulnerability, a small thermal exhaust port that led directly to the station's main reactor. An opening so small that only the most precise and skillful pilot could hope to hit it. And even then, only under conditions that gave almost no room whatsoever for error. Rebel strategists pored over the schematics through the night, running calculations, debating approach vectors, arguing over whether the plan was even remotely feasible given the near impossible margin for error the mission demanded. And more than one officer in that briefing room privately doubted whether any pilot, however skilled, could actually thread a proton torpedo through a target that small while under heavy defensive fire. It was a desperate plan built around a nearly impossible shot. But it was the only plan the rebellion had, and time was running out. The station itself, the rebellion soon learned through intercepted communications, was already moving into position to destroy the very rebel base where R2 and his companions had taken shelter, using its devastating weapon not merely as a threat, but as an active instrument of annihilation, having already proven its terrible capability by obliterating an entire peaceful world in full view of a helpless captive audience meant to witness the demonstration of Imperial power. The battle that followed unfolded in the vacuum above a jungle moon. Rebel starfighters launching in desperate waves against a station so vast that early pilots struggled even to comprehend its scale as they approached, describing it, in radio chatter that would later become legend, as something closer to a small moon than any conventional starship. Among the pilots flying that desperate mission was the farm boy from the desert world, newly trained in the ways of starfighter combat and increasingly aware, through fragments the old hermit had shared with him before falling in the very battle that carried them off-world, of a deeper connection to the mystical energy that bound the galaxy together, an energy his own father had once wielded with extraordinary skill before darkness consumed him entirely. R2-D2 flew with him, mounted in the astromech socket of his starfighter exactly as he had once flown alongside a very different pilot, decades earlier, during a war that already felt, to those who remembered it at all, like a distant and painful memory. The parallel was not lost on those few individuals who understood the full history connecting droid, farm boy, and fallen Jedi, though most involved in the battle had no idea whatsoever that this small droid had done all of this before, had flown into impossible odds beside a gifted young pilot whose fate would ultimately turn on choices made in the heat of desperate combat. The assault on the battle station proved catastrophic for the rebellion's forces, almost from the first moment engagement began. Squadron after squadron of starfighters were cut down by the station's defensive cannons, and by squadrons of Imperial fighters scrambled to intercept the attack. Explosions blooming silently against the black backdrop of space, as pilots who had trained together for months vanished from the formation one by one, their voices cutting off mid-sentence over channels that carried no warning before the static took over entirely. The station's surface defenses tracked incoming fighters with terrifying precision, filling the space above its trenches with a lattice of crossing fire that seemed, to the pilots flying through it, almost impossible to survive, let alone navigate with the kind of precision the mission required. As the surviving rebel pilots made their final desperate runs down the long trench leading toward the exhaust port that represented their only hope of victory, it seemed increasingly likely that the entire mission would end in failure, the rebellion's last hope extinguished along with every pilot, brave enough to have volunteered for what many privately understood to be a suicide run. It was during this final desperate trench run that R2-D2 sustained the worst damage of his entire existence, struck directly by cannon fire as he worked to keep the boys' starfighters' systems functioning through a run that required every ounce of precision the ship's targeting computer and its pilot's own skill could provide. The impact tore through his casing, shutting down entire systems, leaving him a scorched, sparking wreck, barely clinging to functionality as the starfighter he had been mounted to continued its run down the trench without him fully conscious to assist. But even wounded and failing, some last fragment of his processes held on, some final stubborn refusal to simply shut down completely. And it was in that condition, damaged nearly beyond repair, that he witnessed the culmination of everything the mission had been building toward. The boy, in the final seconds before releasing the proton torpedoes that represented the rebellion's last chance, made a choice that defied every conventional strategy his commanders had drilled into him during mission briefings. He trusted an instinct that felt less like calculation and more like guidance from somewhere beyond ordinary perception, an echo of the training the old hermit had begun before his death. Incomplete, but apparently enough, he switched off his targeting computer entirely, relying instead on nothing but that instinct, and delivered a shot that found the narrow exhaust port with a precision that no mechanical targeting system could have guaranteed. The battle station's reactor ignited in a chain reaction that consumed the entire structure within moments. A blossoming light visible even from the jungle moon below. And with that single shot, the Empire's greatest weapon and its greatest symbol of unstoppable power was reduced to drifting debris scattered across the void. The victory came at a price that included, for a time, uncertainty over whether R2-D2 himself had survived the battle at all. He was recovered from the wreckage of the boy's starfighter in a state so severely damaged that the rebellion's technicians initially doubted whether repair was even possible. His casing scorched black, entire systems fused beyond simple restoration, his dome barely holding together after the impact that had nearly ended him. Word spread quickly through the base that the small droid who had accompanied the mission's most celebrated pilot had very nearly given his existence to make the victory possible, and more than a few rebel personnel, some of whom had barely exchanged a word with the droid before that day, found themselves surprised by how deeply they felt the weight of that possibility. But whatever stubbornness had carried him through decades of war, betrayal, and desperate missions carried him through this crisis as well. Weeks of careful repair work, conducted by technicians who had come to understand, through reputation alone, Exactly how valuable this particular droid had proven himself to be eventually restored him to full functionality, and he emerged from that repair bay not quite the same as before, carrying visible scars from the battle that would remain part of his casing for the rest of his existence. Small reminders etched permanently into his frame of just how close he had come to ending his long service in a burning trench above a jungle moon. The years that followed the destruction of the battle station brought no lasting peace, only a shifting, dangerous new phase in a war that showed no signs of ending. The Empire, humiliated but far from defeated, redoubled its efforts to crush the rebellion entirely, hunting its scattered forces across the galaxy with a relentlessness that forced the Alliance to abandon base after base. Always one step ahead of discovery, always rebuilding in some new hidden location the moment the last one was compromised. R2-D2 remained at the boy's side throughout this period, present for a retreat to a frozen, remote world that seemed for a time isolated enough to offer genuine safety, a hope that proved tragically short-lived when Imperial forces tracked the rebellion there through means that would take considerable effort and no small amount of bitter irony to fully uncover. The assault on that frozen base came in the form of massive armored walkers advancing across open snowfields under heavy defensive fire, mechanical giants whose every footstep sent tremors through the ice as rebel gunners fought a desperate, ultimately doomed effort to hold the perimeter long enough for the base's remaining personnel to escape. Speeders skimmed low across the snow, their pilots attempting increasingly desperate maneuvers to bring down the towering walkers, using little more than improvised tow cables and sheer nerve, a tactic born of necessity rather than any established strategy. Since nothing in the rebellion's arsenal had been designed to counter machines of that scale, operating in such punishing terrain, it was a desperate holding action fought so that the bulk of the rebellion's forces could evacuate before Imperial ground troops overran the base entirely. And by the time the last transport lifted off through the swirling snow, the base that had briefly offered the rebellion genuine hope of a lasting sanctuary had been reduced to a smoking ruin abandoned to the encroaching cold. R2 assisted where he could during the chaos of that retreat, working alongside overwhelmed technicians to keep transport systems functioning as Imperial forces closed in from every direction, and in the aftermath found himself aboard a small transport alongside the boy, now grown considerably more confident in both his piloting skill and his growing, still largely untrained connection to the Force, as they set course for a swampy, remote world where the boy hoped to find further guidance from another old teacher the hermit had spoken of before his death, a diminutive, ancient Jedi master who had spent decades in seclusion following the collapse of the order he had once led. R2 remained with the transport during this period rather than accompanying the boy into the swamp itself, tasked instead with helping the ship's small crew attempt increasingly desperate repairs to a damaged hyperdrive that threatened to strand them permanently within reach of pursuing Imperial forces. The swamp world proved an uncomfortable posting even for a droid built to endure far harsher conditions than most. Its dense, humid atmosphere and murky waters playing havoc with delicate systems never designed for prolonged exposure to that kind of environment. And more than once, during those weeks, R2 found himself sinking into muddy ground that seemed determined to swallow him entirely, hauled back out each time by the ship's exasperated crew who had grown, despite themselves, genuinely fond of the stubborn little droid's persistence. It was during this stretch of the story that R2's less celebrated but no less essential talents came fully into focus once again. The quiet, unglamorous work of keeping machinery running against impossible odds, work that rarely earned him recognition but that had, time and again throughout his existence, proven the difference between survival and disaster for everyone who depended on him. Meanwhile, deep in the swamp, the boy underwent a brief, intense period of training under the tutelage of the ancient Jedi Master, learning fragments of a discipline that would take years to properly master, interrupted before his training could be completed by visions of his friends in mortal danger, a premonition eerily similar to the one that had once haunted his own father decades earlier and driven him, in that earlier case, toward tragedy rather than salvation. The boy left his training incomplete, against his teacher's explicit warnings, to rush toward that danger, a decision that would carry devastating personal consequences even as it demonstrated the same reckless, protective love that had once defined his father before darkness consumed that love entirely and turned it into something monstrous. The rescue mission that followed carried the boy, alongside the smuggler captain's crew and a growing circle of allies, into a city built among the clouds of a distant gas giant, a place of elegant architecture and hidden treachery, where a former friend of the smuggler captain's had struck a desperate bargain with Imperial forces in exchange for protecting his own city from destruction. The rescue mission that followed carried the boy, alongside the smuggler captain's crew and a growing circle of allies, into a city built among the clouds of a distant gas giant, a place of elegant architecture and hidden treachery, where a former friend of the smuggler captain's had struck a desperate bargain with Imperial forces in exchange for protecting his own city from destruction. The betrayal, when it came, unfolded with a courtesy that made it all the more unsettling. Gracious hosts leading their guests into an elegant dining hall only to reveal, moments later, that the entire arrangement had been a trap set by the very masked figure the boy had spent months dreading, yet also, in some quiet corner of himself he could not fully explain, feeling drawn toward. The smuggler captain was tortured and prepared for delivery to a bounty hunter working on behalf of a criminal syndicate, frozen in a block of carbonite as a test of the process before it could be safely used, if it could be safely used at all, on the boy himself, who was, unbeknownst to nearly everyone present, the true prize the masked figure had been hunting all along. It was there that the boy finally confronted, for the first time since his training began, the very masked figure who had once been his father, discovering in the course of that devastating duel a truth so shattering that it nearly cost him everything, a truth that reframed the entire war he had been fighting, the entire loss he believed he had suffered, into something far more complicated and far more painful than simple good versus evil. The duel itself carried him through the city's industrial underbelly, past churning reactor shafts and gantries suspended over dizzying drops, the boy's still incomplete training proving desperately inadequate against an opponent who had spent decades mastering exactly the kind of confrontation now unfolding between them. It ended with the boy gravely wounded, his hand severed by a blow he had no answer for, dangling from a narrow ledge above an abyss with no apparent escape. And it was in that moment of absolute desperation that the masked figure delivered the revelation that would haunt the boy for the rest of his life. A revelation about parentage that upended everything he believed about his own origins and about the nature of the war he had committed himself to fighting. R2-D2 was present for the aftermath of that revelation, present for the boy's grim, silent recovery aboard the ship that finally carried them to safety, though whether the droid understood. In that moment, the full weight of what the boy had just learned, or whether some part of him, if his memory truly had survived the years intact, already knew exactly what had been revealed and had simply been waiting with characteristic patience for the truth to finally surface on its own, remained as uncertain and unspoken as every other secret R2-D2 had carried throughout his long existence. Months passed before R2-D2 found himself drawn into the next great chapter of this unfolding story. Months spent in the quiet, grinding work of keeping a scattered rebellion alive while its leadership regrouped and planned their next move against an empire that showed no sign of slowing its pursuit. But the boy had not forgotten the friends who had been lost during the chaos of their escape from the Cloud City, particularly the smuggler captain, frozen in a state of suspended animation and delivered as a trophy to a notorious crime lord operating from a fortified palace on the very desert world, where this entire story had first found its footing all those years earlier. Rescuing him became a personal mission for the boy and his remaining allies, one that would carry R2-D2 back to the sands he had once crossed alone as a fugitive carrying stolen secrets, though this time under circumstances considerably more theatrical and considerably more dangerous. The crime lord's palace was a place of decadence and cruelty in equal measure, populated by smugglers, bounty hunters, and creatures of every description, all of them loyal, through fear rather than affection, to a bloated, ancient gangster who ruled his small criminal empire with casual brutality, holding court from atop a raised dais where he watched over his domain with heavy-lidded eyes, indulging in cruelty as casually as other beings might indulge in a meal. R2-D2 entered that palace disguised as an ordinary service droid, accompanying the boy's allies as part of an elaborate infiltration plan designed to free the frozen smuggler and escape before the crime lord's considerable security forces could react. The plan unfolded with the kind of dramatic complications that seemed to follow this particular group wherever they went, disguises unraveling at precisely the wrong moments, rescue attempts interrupted before they could be completed, and captors growing steadily more suspicious of a group of visitors whose stories, however carefully rehearsed, never quite held together under close scrutiny. The tension built steadily toward a climax that arrived with the boy's own arrival at the palace, no longer the uncertain farmhand who had first left his desert home years earlier, but a composed, capable figure whose growing mastery of the Force was evident in the calm, deliberate way he moved through a den of criminals who would have terrified almost anyone else. When the rescue attempt was ultimately discovered and the entire group found themselves condemned to execution, thrown into a pit inhabited by a monstrous subterranean creature as entertainment for the crime lord's assembled court, it was R2-D2 waiting nearby with a small, concealed compartment built specifically for this contingency, who provided the boy with the one tool that turned the tide of the entire confrontation, launching his own lightsaber directly into his outstretched hand at the precise moment it was needed most. A single, precise throw that arced perfectly across the pit and into waiting fingers, with a timing that left no room whatsoever for error. What followed was a swift, decisive reversal of fortune, the boy cutting through his captors with disciplined focus, the crime lord meeting an end fitting for the cruelty he had inflicted on so many others, strangled by his own captive during the chaos that erupted once the tide had turned, and the entire rescue party escaping the desert world together for the first time in months, reunited and ready to rejoin the wider war still raging across the galaxy. That war was unbeknownst to most of the rebellion at the time, approaching its final and most decisive confrontation. The Empire, in the years since the destruction of its first great battle station, had been secretly constructing a second, even more powerful successor, larger and more heavily armed than its predecessor, and protected this time by an elaborate shield generator projected from the surface of a nearby forest moon, a defense specifically designed to prevent any repeat of the vulnerability that had doomed the first station. Rebel intelligence, gathered at enormous cost and risk, finally uncovered this new threat in time to mount a response, though the scale of what awaited them, both militarily and personally, for several key figures in this unfolding story, exceeded anything the rebellion's leadership had fully anticipated. The plan called for a strike team to infiltrate the forest moon and disable the shield generator from the ground, opening a window during which the rebellion's assembled fleet could launch a direct assault on the battle station itself before its devastating weapon became fully operational. R2-D2 accompanied this strike team, transported down to the moon's surface alongside the boy, the smuggler captain now freed from his frozen imprisonment, the towering first mate, and a growing circle of allies that now included the boy's twin sister, a truth about their shared heritage that had only recently come to light, and that carried implications for the entire unfolding conflict that few beyond the boy himself fully understood. The forest moon proved to be inhabited by a diminutive, technologically primitive but fiercely resourceful native species, initially suspicious of the strike team's presence but eventually won over. As allies, once trust was established through a combination of diplomacy and, in one memorable instance, R2-D2's own resourceful intervention when the strike team found itself captured and in danger of becoming the featured course at what would otherwise have been a considerably less friendly gathering. The natives moved through their forest home with an ease that suggested generations of intimate familiarity, tracking intruders through the underbrush long before those intruders ever suspected they were being watched. And it took the strike team some time to fully appreciate just how thoroughly outmatched they had been from the very first moment they set foot on that moon. A realization that arrived, somewhat awkwardly, only after they had already been captured, bound, and carried back to a native village for a purpose that took considerably longer than anyone would have liked to clarify. The droid's quick thinking during that tense standoff, deploying a hidden flamethrower attachment that startled their captors into a hasty and considerably more cooperative reconsideration of the situation, provided just enough of an opening for the rest of the strike team to secure their release and begin the delicate work of building the alliance that would ultimately prove essential to the mission's success. While the ground team worked to earn the trust and eventual military support of the forest moon's native inhabitants, the boy found himself drawn away from the group entirely, sensing, with a certainty that had grown increasingly difficult to ignore over recent months, that the presence he had once confronted above the Cloud City was near, and that a final confrontation between them, one that had been building since the moment their true relationship was first revealed, could no longer be postponed. He surrendered himself willingly to Imperial forces stationed nearby, choosing to face his father directly, rather than allow that confrontation to unfold on someone else's terms. Driven by a conviction that redemption remained possible even for a man who had spent decades serving the very empire, threatening to crush everything the boy had fought to protect, a conviction his closest allies found difficult to share. Having witnessed firsthand the ruthlessness the masked figure had shown time and again across years of relentless pursuit, R2-D2 remained with the ground team throughout the tense build-up to the final battle, present for the desperate skirmishes fought against Imperial scouting parties who threatened to discover the strike team's position before their preparations were complete, and present in the climactic hours that followed, for a three-front battle that would determine the fate of the entire galaxy within the span of a single, chaotic engagement. On the forest moon surface, the strike team and their newfound native allies fought a desperate guerrilla campaign against Imperial ground forces, defending the shield generator bunker, a battle fought with primitive weapons and improvised tactics against superior firepower, spears and simple projectile traps pitted against blaster rifles and armored transports, but fought with a ferocity and cunning that steadily turned the tide despite overwhelming odds, the native inhabitants using their intimate knowledge of the forest terrain to outmaneuver an enemy far better equipped but far less familiar with the ground beneath their feet. In the space above, the rebellion's assembled fleet engaged the Imperial Navy in a battle of staggering scale, starfighters and capital ships locked in combat that would determine whether the coming assault on the battle station's core could even be attempted. Entire squadrons trading fire against a backdrop of stars, while massive cruisers exchanged devastating broadsides that lit up the void for anyone watching from the surface below. And aboard the battle station itself, in a private chamber far from either battlefield, the boy faced not only his father, but the very emperor who had orchestrated the entire tragedy of the galaxy's recent history, a confrontation that had far less to do with weapons or tactics than with the final, desperate struggle for one man's soul, R2-D2's own contribution to the ground battle. Though less dramatic than the confrontation unfolding aboard the battle station, proved characteristically vital in ways that only became fully clear once the dust had settled, when the shield generator bunker's defenses proved more formidable than anticipated, and the strike team's equipment began failing under the strain of prolonged combat. It was R2, working alongside the smuggler captain's crew, who managed to keep critical systems functioning long enough for the assault to succeed, patching damaged equipment and rerouting failing power sources with the same stubborn, uncelebrated competence that had defined his entire existence since the earliest days of a war fought decades earlier above a very different world entirely. When the shield generator finally fell and the bunker's defenses were breached, opening the path for the rebellion's fleet to begin its assault on the battle station's unshielded core, it was, in no small measure, because a small astromech droid had once again refused to let mechanical failure determine the outcome of a battle that mattered more than any single droid could fully comprehend. Aboard the battle station, the confrontation between father and son reached its terrible, cathartic climax, when the boy, pushed to the brink of falling to darkness himself after witnessing the Emperor's casual cruelty toward his sister, unleashed a furious assault against his own father that ended with the masked figure defeated and at his mercy. But rather than delivering the killing blow the Emperor demanded, the boy cast his weapon aside, declaring that he would rather die than allow himself to become the very thing his father had become, an act of mercy and faith that succeeded where every previous attempt to reach the man beneath the mask had failed. It was this act, this refusal to give in to hatred even in the face of his own destruction, that finally stirred something long buried beneath decades of darkness, a final flicker of the man who had once been a gifted, idealistic Jedi Knight, a man who had once, so very long ago, treated a small astromech droid, not as mere equipment, but as a genuine companion. In the final moments of that confrontation, as the Emperor turned his full, devastating power against the boy who refused to fight back, The man in the black armor made a choice that would define the rest of his legacy far more than any of the darkness that had preceded it. He turned against the master he had served for decades, lifting him bodily and casting him into the reactor shaft below, sacrificing himself in the process to save the life of the son he had spent years hunting without ever fully understanding why the boy's continued existence troubled him so deeply. The battle station's reactor, already destabilized by the rebellion's assault on its now unshielded core, began its final collapse, and the boy, carrying his dying father from the wreckage in the last possible moments before the entire station tore itself apart, managed to reach an escape shuttle just as the structure that had represented the Empire's ultimate weapon disintegrated into an expanding cloud of debris and fire. R2-D2 was present in the aftermath of that battle. For a moment that closed the circle of his entire existence in a way that few beings in the galaxy would ever fully appreciate. The dying man who had once been the Empire's most feared enforcer. And long before that, a gifted young Jedi Knight who had once spoken to a small astromech droid as though he mattered, asked, in his final moments, to see his son's face without the mask and armor that had defined his identity for decades, a request granted quietly and without ceremony on the forest moon, where the rebellion's forces had gathered to celebrate their victory. The mask came away slowly, revealing a face pale and scarred beneath, eyes that had not seen unfiltered light in longer than the boy had been alive. And for a brief, quiet moment before the end, something in that ruined face seemed almost peaceful, as though a burden carried for decades had finally, at long last, been set down. He died there, in his son's arms, having finally shed both the mask and the darkness it represented, and whatever memories R2-D2 carried of the idealistic young man this same figure had once been, wiped clean or quietly preserved through decades of careful silence, found their final, quiet resolution in that moment, a resolution that no words, spoken or beeped, could have adequately captured. That night, on the surface of the forest moon, the small native inhabitants who had fought alongside the strike team gathered with the surviving rebels in a celebration that stretched across their entire settlement, bonfires lighting up a canopy of ancient trees. While word of the battle station's destruction spread across a galaxy that had spent decades under the shadow of an empire many had begun to believe was simply a permanent feature of existence as unchangeable as the stars themselves. Fireworks that had once been the weapons of war now lit up the night sky in celebration instead. Drums and unfamiliar instruments filling the clearing with music that needed no translation to be understood as pure, uncomplicated joy. A sound the forest moon's inhabitants had likely never had cause to make in quite the same way before this particular night. R2-D2 rolled through that celebration alongside his old protocol droid companion, the two of them, an unlikely mismatched pair amid the joy and relief surrounding them. And if a droid built for astromech maintenance could be said to experience something like contentment, it seemed, to those who noticed him weaving quietly through the celebrating crowd, that this small droid had finally found a moment of genuine peace after decades spent carrying secrets heavy enough to reshape the fate of an entire galaxy. The boy who had once been a restless farmhand, dreaming of adventures beyond his desert horizon, stood now as one of the architects of the Empire's final defeat. Though he carried that victory with a quiet, weathered gravity rather than any triumphant celebration of his own, having paid for it with a loss that few among the celebrating crowd fully understood. His sister stood beside him, herself only recently come to understand the full weight of her own heritage, the daughter of the very man whose death had made this celebration possible, a truth she carried with a complexity that mixed grief, anger, and something approaching forgiveness in proportions that would likely take her years to fully reconcile. And nearby, watching over both of them with the same quiet vigilance he had maintained since the earliest days of their acquaintance, stood the small astromech droid who had, in one way or another, been present for nearly every defining moment of both their lives, though neither of them, even now, fully understood exactly how far back that presence truly extended. Consider, for a moment, everything this one droid carried within him by the close of that celebration, whether preserved through careful memory or reconstructed through decades of quiet observation. He had witnessed the birth of a friendship that would grow into one of history's most consequential partnerships, watched a young Jedi rise to extraordinary heights, only to fall into a darkness that would consume an entire galaxy for a generation, kept secret, a marriage that, had it been discovered, might have changed the entire course of the war that followed. He had witnessed the fall of a republic and the rise of an empire, had carried within his own memory banks the plans that would eventually doom that empire's greatest weapon, had flown into battle not once but twice, against odds that should have ended his existence both times, and had, in the final reckoning, stood present for the redemption of the very man whose fall he had once witnessed so many years earlier. A circle closed not through any grand gesture on his own part, but simply through the quiet, patient persistence of a droid who never stopped showing up, mission after mission, decade after decade, no matter how dangerous or hopeless the circumstances seemed. Few beings in the history of that galaxy, organic or mechanical, could claim to have stood at the center of so much consequence while asking for so little recognition in return. It would be easy, looking back across the full sweep of this story, to focus entirely on the organic figures who occupied its center stage, the fallen Jedi Knight and the son who redeemed him, the senator who became a symbol of resistance, the farm boy who became a legend in his own right. Their names would be remembered in the histories written after the Empire's final collapse, celebrated in monuments and stories passed down for generations. R2-D2's name would appear in few of those accounts, mentioned, if at all, as a footnote, a helpful droid who happened to be present for several important events, his true significance reduced to a passing detail in a history that preferred grand narratives about individual heroism to the quieter, more persistent truth of what had actually carried so many of those heroic moments forward. But those who had actually served alongside him, who had trusted him with secrets that could have ended their lives, who had depended on his stubborn competence in moments when every other option had already failed, understood something the official histories would never quite capture. They understood that an empire had fallen not merely because of lightsaber duels and starfighter runs, but because a small, unassuming droid had refused, across decades of impossible circumstances, to ever stop working, to ever betray a trust once given, to ever accept that his role was simply to serve without judgment or purpose of his own. He had opinions. He had loyalties. He had, in whatever sense a machine can be said to possess such things, a will of his own. And he had spent that will, patiently and without complaint, in service of people and causes he had judged, through some process no engineer could fully explain, to be worth that service. In the years that followed the Empire's final collapse, as the galaxy slowly began the long, difficult work of rebuilding what decades of tyranny had broken, R2-D2 continued in service, much as he always had, moving from mission to mission, from ally to ally, never seeking retirement, never seeking recognition beyond the quiet satisfaction of work well done. New governments would need to be built from the wreckage of the old one. New alliances forged between worlds that had spent a generation learning to distrust one another, and countless small, unglamorous tasks would need doing in every corner of that long, uncertain process. The very kind of work a droid like R2 had spent his entire existence quietly, faithfully performing. He had, by that point, outlived Jedi Masters and Senate careers, had witnessed the birth and death of an entire political order, had carried secrets that could have reshaped galactic history and chosen, again and again, to carry them in silence rather than let them out into a galaxy that might not have known what to do with them. He remained, through all of it, exactly what he had always been, from the very first moment his processors came online, aboard a starship on a peaceful, distant world. A droid who paid attention, who cared, in his own quiet way, about the beings he served, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the galaxy, that some of the most important battles are never fought with lightsabers or starfighters at all, but with nothing more than patience, loyalty, and the simple, stubborn refusal to give up. If there is a lesson buried in the long, winding story of this small, unassuming droid, it is perhaps this. Greatness does not always announce itself with grand speeches or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it looks like a droid rolling out onto the exposed hull of a starship under fire, quietly doing the work that no one else can do while the galaxy's fate hangs in the balance around him. Sometimes it looks like silence, kept faithfully across decades, protecting secrets that could destroy everything if they fell into the wrong hands. Sometimes it looks like simply refusing to give up, mission after mission, crisis after crisis, long after anyone still watching would have forgiven a much lesser being for finally, quietly, letting go. It rarely looks like what the stories tell us to expect, and perhaps that is exactly why it so often goes unnoticed until long after it has already changed everything. And so the story of R2-D2 closes here, not with a grand farewell or a final dramatic act, but with the same quiet persistence that had carried him through everything that came before. Somewhere across that healing, rebuilding galaxy, a small blue and white astromech droid continued to roll from mission to mission, still curious, still stubborn, still watching everything around him, with the same quiet attention that had defined him since the very beginning. He had seen an empire rise and fall. He had carried the galaxy's darkest secrets and its brightest hopes in equal measure, and he had never once, in all those long years, needed a single word to prove exactly how much he mattered. Let the histories remember whoever they choose to remember. Somewhere in that story, quietly, patiently, without ever asking for credit, there was always a small droid keeping everything together. And perhaps, in the end, that is the truest kind of heroism there is.